Hello everyone, it's 7 o'clock and we start this morning with a reported claim from Prince Harry that he was physically confronted by his brother William in a row over his relationship with Meghan Markle. Those allegations are made in a leaked copy of his new book, seen by the Guardian newspaper. We'll have all the latest on that. Plus, another day, another strike. Rail passengers are facing a third day of significant disruption this week, with warnings that swathes of the country will have no trains running at all as train drivers start their walkout. We'll be joined by the head of the ASLEF union, Mick Whelan, and we'll also hear from the Rail Delivery Group, which represents the train companies. It's Thursday, the 5th of January. Prince Harry reportedly accuses his brother William of a physical confrontation over his relationship with Meghan Markle in a leaked copy of his book, seen by the Guardian newspaper. As train drivers begin a fresh walkout this morning, the government is poised to bring in anti-strike laws as early as this week.
Passengers are warned of significant disruption with no trains running in some areas. I'll bring you the latest from Victoria Station.
No longer the party of big spending, Sir Keir Starmer to set out Labour's plans in his first speech of the year. The funeral of Pope Benedict takes place this morning, presided over by his successor. We'll be live from the Vatican, where tens of thousands of mourners are gathering to pay their respects. Online retail giant Amazon announces the biggest round of layoffs in the company's history. And in the US, deadlock in Congress as the Republicans fail for a sixth time to elect a new House Speaker. Hello, a very good morning to you and a warm welcome to Sky News Breakfast. Well, Prince Harry has reportedly claimed that he was physically confronted by his brother William in a row over his relationship with Meghan Markle. Well, those allegations are made in a leaked copy of his new book, which is set to be published next week and seen by the Guardian newspaper. Well, Sky News has approached Kensington Palace for a response. In the meantime, let's talk to our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills, who joins me now. So, Rhiannon, some pretty serious claims being reported today. What can you tell us about them?
Yeah, so anticipation has really been ramping up, I think, over the last few months ahead of this book being released. We, of course, knew that the title was going to be Spare. We've had that Netflix docuseries. And people have been wondering exactly how far Prince Harry would go when it came to writing down his recollections and what he has wanted to share. But the claims that we're hearing from this leaked copy are quite extraordinary when it comes to the breakdown in the relationship that he had with his brother. Now, it's worth saying that the book, the review copies, aren't due out until Monday. They're not due to be released into the public until Tuesday, and yet the Guardian seem to have had a copy in advance. Now, I'll just read to you some of what it says in this Guardian article in terms of this altercation, which it seems happened, or Prince Harry claims happened back in 2019. He says that it was all to do with William basically calling Meghan abrasive, rude, and difficult. He then writes that William came into their home at Nottingham Cottage. Harry gave him a glass of water and said, "Willie, I can't speak to you when you're like this." Harry then writes, he set down the water, called me another name, then came at me. It all happened so fast, so very fast. He grabbed me by the collar, ripping my necklace, and he knocked me to the floor. I landed on the dog's bowl, which cracked under my back, the pieces cutting into me. I lay there for a moment, dazed, then got to my feet and told him to get out. Now, they are very serious allegations. This morning I have reached out to two people at Kensington Palace for any comment. So far, haven't heard anything back from them. We know that in 2019, that relationship between the two brothers was falling apart, not simply because of those leaked reports, which Harry has repeatedly talked about in the Netflix documentary, and these interviews that are due to be released on Sunday with the likes of Anderson Cooper for CBS and Tom Bradby for ITV, but also because Harry himself in a documentary talked about how he wasn't getting on with his brother. So it's not unexpected to hear that the brothers were not getting on in 2019. But it is shocking to be given this much personal detail. I think in the past there's been criticisms of Harry that he's made some very damning allegations when it comes to racism within the palace, or allegations that they weren't taking Meghan's mental health issues seriously enough. But there have been suggestions that they haven't gone far enough in naming specifics. But it seems that Harry, in this book, is not holding back.
Indeed. Rhiannon, thanks very much indeed. Now, huge parts of the country will once again have no trains running today as train drivers from the ASLEF union begin their walkout. And further strikes are looming, with the RMT set to stage another 48-hour strike on Friday and Saturday. Well, meanwhile, the government is expected to unveil new anti-strike laws over the coming days. Well, our correspondent Saba Chowdhury is at Victoria Station for us this morning. So, Saba, what's the level of disruption that's expected for passengers today?
Good morning. Well, just to give you a bit of context before we start, it is the ASLEF train union's 6th day of strike action since last summer, and today around 12,500 train drivers are expected to be walking out, which means that about 20% of trains today won't be operating. Now, ASLEF's leader, Mick Whelan, has said that the cost of living crisis has particularly hit his members hard, and that they feel that a pay increase is long overdue. And for this reason, amongst his members, there is a vast will to be in this, he says, for the long haul, and that his members feel they need to go faster and harder in their strike action to get their message heard, and that because of that, strike action is likely to be inevitable, Mick Whelan has said. Now, this week overall has been a tricky week for commuters. This is not the first strike day that we've seen. The RMT union this week have 2 48-hour strike days, the next one being on Friday and Saturday, and that is in a separate dispute about pay, about changes in terms and conditions in contracts, and also job security when it comes to several different roles. Now, the overarching message between various groups striking is one and the same. It's come to the negotiating table, here are demands, and the strikes will stop. And also, in addition to that, it's check before you travel.
Always good advice. Saba, thanks very much indeed. Now, the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, will set out his vision for a Labour government later on today in his first speech of the year. He's expected to say that Labour is no longer the party of big spending, vowing that he would not get its big government chequebook out again. Well, this comes a day after Rishi Sunak made his own speech about priorities for the year ahead. So let's hear a little bit more about all of this. The Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is with me now. So, Rachel Reeves, we're told that today's speech from Sir Keir Starmer will be all about what he stands for. So what does Keir Starmer stand for?
Good morning, Anna. It's great to be on your programme this morning. Keir's speech today will be setting out some of the vision for a Labour leadership and a Labour government, and particularly focusing on the fact that our country seems to lurch from crisis to crisis with sticking plaster policies to paper over the cracks, rather than addressing some of the long-term challenges that we face as a country. And that is what Keir is determined to do as our next Prime Minister, to actually get a grip of some of the long-term underlying problems with our health service, with our economy, with our energy supply, and so much more, to put us on a firmer footing, to make us more resilient and more secure as a society and as an economy, to face into the big challenges. And Keir and myself are under no illusion about the scale of the challenges that we will inherit. So a big set of challenges, but we are ambitious for the country. We see so much potential, and we want to unleash that to really secure better public services and also improvements in living standards that, frankly, people haven't seen for a decade or more.
Well, the government, Rishi Sunak, would no doubt say that they're also tackling those long-term challenges. And just yesterday, we heard from the Prime Minister, didn't we? He says he's putting forward some concrete promises on that front, those 5 pledges on debt, jobs, waiting lists and small boats. The things that he says are people's main priorities. Are those Labour's priorities too?
Well, look, everybody wants to see waiting lists come down, small boat crossings end. But look, the Prime Minister yesterday has announced a set of ambitions to fix the problems that him and his government have created, and then wants the public to give him the credit for doing that. I just don't think it washes. The Conservatives have had 13 years now, and the question that people will be asking is, are my family and me better off after 13 years of Conservative government? Are our public services, our schools and our hospitals better run and in better condition than they were 13 years ago? And frankly, is anything in our country working better than it was when the Conservatives came to power? And I think the answer to those questions is no. And that's why people are turning away from the Conservatives and looking again at Labour. And for the first time in quite a long time, I think Labour can look to the country knowing that we have the answers, the fully costed and funded policies to address some of the long-term big challenges that we face as a country, and give people some hope back and some belief back that things can be better than the mess that we've been in these last few years.
OK, you want to give people hope back. The last time we heard from Keir Starmer was a speech with Gordon Brown on devolution, which may be important, but it may not necessarily be something you put on a pledge card. It may not be something that may give people hope. So are we going to get new policies today?
Well, look, when I'm in my constituency in Leeds, and I'll be there this evening, when I travel around the country, people have huge ambition and pride in their communities, and they want a government that matches that ambition and that pride, but also empowers local people and community to take decisions on their behalf, rather than always having to come cap in hand to the government to ask them for money and for support and resources to power their communities. We want to give power to local people and local communities to make decisions on their own behalf, to realise the potential of their communities. And that's why the plans that Keir put forward at the end of last year to devolve more power, to give away more power to regions and nations and communities across Britain, it is so exciting, because for the first time in a long time, local people will be able to make decisions on their behalf, rather than having to ask government to be able to do things, whether it's on buses or trains or transport or energy or housing, actually make those decisions for themselves.
OK, so we're going to hear more about devolution, is what you're saying. What about new policies? Will we get anything new from Keir Starmer today?
Well, look, you hear the speech, and Keir will set that out. But the key theme in the speech today is that we need to tackle the long-term challenges that our country faces. Because while every country in the world has been exposed to shocks from COVID to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we in Britain have been uniquely exposed. We ran down our health service, we ran down our PPE supplies, and so we were ill-prepared for the COVID pandemic. We got rid of our gas storage, we banned onshore wind, and we stopped our home insulation programme, which meant that we were exposed to increases in gas and electricity prices. We can't keep lurching from crisis to crisis. We need Labour's Green Prosperity Plan to ensure that we have energy security and independence while keeping prices low. We need to reform our health service, but also resource it properly, with one of the biggest expansions of the workforce in history, funded by getting rid of the non-dom tax status, so that we can afford more doctors and nurses and midwives and health visitors. Those are just some of the policies that Labour will be setting out in more detail over the next year, that can make us stronger as an economy, stronger as a society, more resilient to the shocks that face not just Britain but around the world, but for which Britain has been particularly exposed to because of the neglect from the Conservatives.
So you want to boost the number of doctors. You say you're going to fund that from banning non-dom status. But what about day-to-day spending on the NHS? Keir Starmer, we're told, will say that his pledges shouldn't be taken as code for getting the chequebook out. So does that mean that the NHS will get no more money beyond what was promised in the autumn statement?
Well, we've set out how we would get rid of the non-dom tax status, which costs £3.2 billion a year, and we would plough that money into training more doctors and nurses, because one of the big problems that we've got is of retention and recruitment in our National Health Service, which means every day of the week, not just when there's industrial action. It's a real challenge to get that doctor's appointment, to be seen at A&E, to get an ambulance when you need it and get a bed in a hospital. And so we've committed to that expansion of doubling the number of places every year at medical school, as well as expansions of midwife, district nurses and nurses training places as well. And we know that these things won't happen overnight. And we know that it takes time to train doctors and nurses. But under Labour, the cavalry is coming. We will invest in the workforce, in the NHS. We also know that more is needed this winter, and if we were in power today, we would be doing more to ensure that people could be discharged from hospital, because our social care system would be working better. We would be reforming doctors' pensions so that doctors aren't taking early retirement because it just doesn't stack up financially for them to continue at work. We would introduce fair pay agreements for our social care sector to help recruitment and retention there, and we would launch a jabs army to get people to be administering, as we had during the COVID pandemic, the jabs for COVID and flu, to help people ensure that they're properly protected through these winter months, because we know more and more beds are being taken up in our hospitals because of people with flu and COVID. So we need to make sure that that vaccination programme for both flu and COVID are being properly rolled out. But look, it's really important that every policy that Labour puts forward is fully costed and fully funded. It's what the electorate expect from us, and it shows a respect for the electorate that we show where the money is going to come from. And every line in our manifesto will be fully costed and fully funded. We've said that we would get rid of the non-dom tax status and use that to fund our National Health Service. I think that's the right priority for our economy and for our country.
OK, Rachel Reeves, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks so much. So our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, is with me now. So another day, another big speech. This time, Sir Keir Starmer laying out what it means, what a Labour government might look like. How much have we learned from Rachel Reeves this morning about that, do you think?
Well, these are going to be really, by the end of today, we'll see the contours of the next election. We had Rishi Sunak yesterday, who, of course, became Prime Minister in very chaotic circumstances for the first time, saying, this is what I'm about. I've got these 5 pledges, some of them a lot easier to deliver than others, 3 of them on the economy, small boats and NHS waiting lists, and saying, in 2 years, I'll have made some progress on all of them, he says. Keir Starmer, obviously been party leader for a lot longer, but a lot of it was during COVID. He's had these internal battles with his party, which are ongoing. I mean, this speech is very much designed to say the era of Jeremy Corbyn is over, the era of big spending. We're not going to spend our way out of this mess, is what he'll say. So what do you do about the big challenges like the NHS, like these public sector strikes, like the cost of living and people's energy bills? If you're not going to spend a lot more money, well, that's going to be what he's challenged on. You can see that Rishi Sunak has very much tried to make strikes and standing up for discipline with spending a key dividing line. How will Keir Starmer respond to that? And will he be able to connect with the public, tell the public about his values, as we heard a bit from Rishi Sunak yesterday, in a way which makes them, of course, Labour are 20 points ahead in the polls, but will they see him as a future Prime Minister today? That will be the challenge. I think sometimes Labour have focused on some of the very important long-term issues, but has he got anything really voter-friendly to offer people immediately?
Yeah, it'll be an interesting one to watch. Tamara, thanks very much indeed. Well, the funeral for Pope Benedict XVI will be held at the Vatican this morning, making history as it's presided over by the current Pope, Pope Francis. Well, our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, joins us now from Vatican City. So, Adam, tell us a little bit about what we can expect later on this morning, then.
Well, for a start, it is a pretty chilly, misty, rather evocative day. here in Vatican City, and thousands upon thousands of people are pouring into this tiny city-state for an occasion that is, in a sense, unprecedented, certainly in modern times, because this funeral of the Pope Emeritus, Benedict XVI, will be presided over by the present Pope, Pope Francis. And this is the first time this has happened for many hundreds of years. It's nearly 600 years since a Pope resigned from the job. A couple of hundred years ago, we did have a funeral conducted by Pope for a predecessor, but that was there'd been a long gap. This is something very unusual because, of course, Benedict spent the rest of his life after retirement living here in the Vatican, almost in the shadow of his successor. And I think in death, as much as in life, that question of his resignation, of his retirement from the role, will linger over the surface, and all of the questions it raises, some of them still unresolved. As for what we're going to see, well, the order of service goes on for 37 pages. It's going to take a couple of hours, starting in just over an hour's time from now. And the nature of it will be very similar to that of a funeral service for an incumbent pope, but not identical. And that has been, in a way, the theme throughout. The lying in state of Pope Benedict was similar to that will be organised for an incumbent pope, but also slightly different. He wasn't wearing the full papal vestments as he laid in state, although he was holding rosary beads. But those will be added into the coffin alongside some coins and also a document written in Latin outlining the achievements of his papacy. As is traditional with popes, he'll be buried in 3 coffins, a cedar wood coffin originally, then surrounded by a zinc coffin, and then a further wooden coffin. And after the service, which will be led by Francis, who will deliver that service, we understand, while sitting in a wheelchair, Benedict, will be buried beneath St. Peter's Basilica in a tomb previously occupied by his predecessor, John Paul II. The focus then will be on how the death of Benedict changes the papacy of Pope Francis and whether he may yet follow that precedent with his own retirement.
Adam, thanks very much indeed. And just to let you know that we will have full coverage of the Pope's funeral later on this morning, with the service due to begin at around 8:30. In the meantime, do stay with us, still to come here on the show. I'm going to be joined by the General Secretary of the ASLEF Union, Mick Whelan, as passengers face a 3rd consecutive day of travel disruption this week. The chair of the Rail Delivery Group and Managing Director of First Rail, Steve Montgomery, will be also joining me to discuss the long-running dispute over pay for rail staff. That's coming up very shortly. First, though, let's take a look at some of the day's other headlines. And Amazon intends to cut more than 18,000 job roles as part of a workforce reduction strategy, according to its chief executive. Andy Jassy says the cuts, which amount to 6% of its corporate workforce, will mostly impact the company's e-commerce and human resources departments. The man suspected of stabbing to death 4 university students in their beds has arrived in Idaho to face murder charges after he voluntarily agreed to be extradited from Pennsylvania. 28-year-old Brian Koberger is alleged to have killed housemates in November last year. Mr. Koberger denies murder. New car registrations have fallen to their lowest level since 1992 due to global supply chain issues and shortages. That's according to the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, which says around 1.61 million new cars were registered in 2022. That's down 2% from the year before. Passengers flying from mainland China to England will need to take a COVID-19 test before departure from today. The European Union has also strongly encouraged its member states to impose testing. China has seen a surge in cases since relaxing its zero COVID policy at the end of last year. So let's get the latest on our top story today, and the continuing strikes are going on. Today's strike is being called by the ASLEF union, and I'm joined now by Mick Whelan, who's the General Secretary. So very good morning to you. Thanks so much for coming in, Mick Whelan. So today's action will be the drivers' 6th coordinated day of strike action since last summer. Have you made any progress with either the rail companies or the governments in that time?
Very little. It's been a long ongoing process. I've attended every negotiation personally. And I think we're as far away now as we were at the start, unfortunately.
There have been some newspaper reports today that have suggested that the government might be on the brink of offering workers a new pay deal. The suggestion is it would be worth around £2,000 a year. Have you heard anything along those lines?
Well, it's nice that they tell the newspapers and the media before they tell us, the people that have actually been in the talks. And obviously we'd like to know what strings go with it. I mean, as we enter 2023, this is the 4th year without a pay rise. And we'd normally this time of year, be getting ready to go into pay talks for 2023. We've seen inflation during a period of time run at 14%, in double digits this year. So the figures that are being spoke about don't really put a dent in the cost of living crisis.
So if that was offered to you, would you reject it?
I'd have to have a look at it first. I mean, the idea that people float stuff and then you're asked whether you'll accept it or not without seeing the details and strings that go with it is very, very difficult to comment on.
How difficult do you think it is to get the public on board when you're talking about pay? Because there might be some people that say train drivers are paid quite well, aren't they? I think looking at some of the figures, train drivers earn an average of around £48,500, starting salaries around £30,000. They might say nurses, for example, are paid a lot less.
Well, I think nurses should have what we have. I believe the fire brigade and public sector's workers, I believe that teachers and vocational staff should have what we have. But I've never been quite in the game of politics and envy. Nobody's actually ever given us anything. Over the course of privatisation, we've given massive productivity and flexibility to generate what we've got. And this idea then that we shouldn't have a pay rise for 10 years to allow other people that are underpaid to catch up with us is quite not one we subscribe to.
What about how these negotiations have been carried out? There are also some suggestions around that the government is looking to try to strike a deal with the RMT, with ASLEF rather, in a bid to isolate the RMT. Have you heard anything about that? Do you see any signs of that? I saw
it in the papers yesterday, and it's nonsense. We won't do that. I mean, we have our strike, and we're doing what we're doing. I've got great praise for my comrades and colleagues in the RMT who are fighting an existential battle where they want to take away 50% of people's jobs and degrade what's left. And I think if the government gets away with what it's doing, we'll be left with an inherently unsafe railway system. We'll have other problems. Our problem is that we work for 15 privatised companies that we're on strike with today, and they've done a rather corrupt deal with the government that won't allow a pay rise to take place, all the talks to take place through free collective bargaining, which they should do.
But what about the government's argument that there isn't a bottomless pit of money? They can't necessarily afford to pay everybody who's asking for pay rises what they're asking for. So
we didn't seek a pay rise during the pandemic and we went to work. During that period of time, the people we worked for made £500 million in profits. If you look at Companies House and the pay rises of directors, the dividends that have been paid and profits made by the rail operating companies, it seems that wages are no longer part of their fixed costs, that they can pay dividends to their shareholders out of the taxpayers' purse, but the people who actually generate those dividends don't get a share. This is a frustrating time for passengers, isn't it? Look, I'd much rather be talking to you about a green agenda. I'd like to talk about safer railways, investment, growing railways. I'd like to go back to my day job, if I'm honest. But we are where we are. And, if we don't raise our issues and articulate our voice, no one's listening to us. I wouldn't be on here today unless we were on strike, would I? Well, the government clearly feels that passengers are frustrated. They're talking about new anti-strike legislation, aren't they? They're talking about minimum service guarantees. There's some suggestion around that could even potentially mean that strikes could be deemed illegal if unions refuse to provide that minimum level of service. What do you make of those reports? Well, we already have the most draconian and authoritarian strike laws and trade union laws in Europe. Only Lithuania had worse, and I think more recently with the trade union bill we actually outdid them. We have seen our counterparts in Europe introduce minimum strike levels and are unworkable. The idea then that in companies that don't fully employ enough people, that people could be forced to come to work when they legitimately and legally should be on strike would be difficult to see how it could be done. But we'll look at the detail of those laws. If we have to comply with them, we will. It's more likely to lead to longer strife and a different form of action, because there will be a knock-on effect by anything that happens. And would you consider taking legal action against the government if a policy like that were to be introduced? We're currently, with 11 other trade unions, taking legal action against the last set of laws they put in place, and we would look at doing that in future as well.
Looking at some of the figures, they're quite startling this week, aren't they, about the amount of money that people are losing from the hospitality sector, for example, because of rail strikes. Doesn't there have to be some sort of minimum service to allow people to run their businesses, allow people to go to work?
Well, the real problem is the logistics of the railways. Trains run round to be in the right places for the peaks. Minimum service levels that subsequently got negotiated on a company-by-company basis, when you look at something as complex as the interconnectivity of the railway, to my mind, is unworkable. And at what point does it become unsafe? What would the level be? Would it be 20%? Would it be 30%? Would the only way to run a safe railway be 100% and take away the right to strike totally? What sort of democracy are we aiming for?
Rishi Sunak has said his door is always open to the negotiations. When do you next expect to have talks with the government and with the rail companies?
I met with the Transport Minister and the Rail Minister before Christmas, and they dropped me a note saying that the Rail Minister is now going to be facilitating the talks. I meet with the Rail Minister on Monday. I'm hoping shortly after that we get back into a round where we have effectual talks and can resolve the situation.
You said you're in it for the long haul, though. How long do you think this could go on?
Well, when you're asked the question about how long will you do something for, you do it till you find a resolution. So if it has to be the long haul, it will do. I was also asked the question, will there be more strikes? And I said that we've just reinforced all our mandates. Now people are saying we should go harder and faster. Now, we haven't done that yet.
OK, well, Mick Whelan, we appreciate you coming in. I imagine you're going down to the picket line now, are you?
I've got one or two media things to do, then I'm on the picket line at Euston and King's Cross. Thank you.
OK, thanks very much indeed for your time. So the chair of the rail delivery group, Steve Montgomery, is going to be on the show as well to discuss that long-running dispute over pay and working conditions for rail staff as well. He's coming on a little bit later, so do stay with us for that. Hello, welcome back. We're going to turn our attention to the US now. And despite multiple rounds of voting, the Republican Party has once again been unable to elect Kevin McCarthy, who's served as their majority leader for the last 4 years, as the next Speaker of the House of Representatives. Despite winning a narrow majority in November's elections, the Republicans have now failed 6 times to elect a Speaker. That's the first time in 100 years that the House has been unable to agree on a candidate. From Washington, our US correspondent Mark Stone reports.
They gathered for a second day with the chair they need to fill still empty. The engine room of the American Democratic machine is rudderless, unable to choose its leader.
Madam Clerk, I rise to nominate Hakeem Jeffries as Speaker of the House.
Kevin McCarthy for Speaker of the House.
Byron Donalds for Speaker of the House of Representatives.
To find a mess comparable to this, you'd need to go back a century. It's all about this man, Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader of a House that now has a Republican majority. So he should be the Speaker. But beyond the backpats, it hasn't quite gone to plan.
The gentleman is recognized.
For a second day, his allies nominated him. But again, he fell short of the votes. It's only week 1 of the year, and American political drama is in full swing. This is about more than just the messy mechanics of democracy, because it is exposing the deep, deep divisions within just one party. The Republican Party's majority is so narrow that they can't even get this legislative session open. Until they literally get their house in order, American democracy is stalled. The smiles for the cameras he knows are on him mask the embarrassment.
Jeffries.
More voted for the minority Democratic leader than voted for him. On the other side of the chamber, the Republican rebels plotted their next move, and yet the man they'd naturally follow, Donald Trump, is backing the man they won't, McCarthy. Even his caps-locked command hasn't pulled them into line. Among the rebels, Congressman Bob Good.
We're going to resolve this in a few hours or a few days or even a couple of weeks, but we will live with this decision for 2 years before the next election, and folks aren't going to be voting in the next election based on how long it took for us to choose a speaker.
Down Pennsylvania Avenue at the White House, a president aware of the look.
It's not a good thing. It's the United States of America, and I hope they get their act together.
And what's going to happen if
We are learning plenty through all this. Yes, American politics is in an almighty mess. And yes, the power of Trump, it does seem to be waning. But beyond all that, one of the 2 parties dominating politics here is so fractured, it's paralyzing the political process. The Speaker's chair still empty. Mark Stone, Sky News in Washington.
So commuters are suffering with a third consecutive day of travel disruption this week as members of ASLEF at 15 rail operators have walked out over pay disputes. Meanwhile, the government is also preparing to unveil new anti-strike laws in the coming days, which could allow it to take legal action against unions over striking members. Well, earlier I spoke to the General Secretary of ASLEF, Mick Whelan, and asked his reaction.
We already have the most draconian and authoritarian strike laws and trade union laws in Europe. Only Lithuania had worse, and I think more recently with the trade union bill we actually outdid them. We have seen our counterparts in Europe introduce minimum strike levels that are unworkable. The idea then that in companies that don't fully employ enough people, that people could be forced to come to work when they legitimately and legally should be on strike would be difficult to see how it could be done. But we'll look at the detail of those laws. If we have to comply with them, we will. It's more likely to lead to longer strife and a different form of action because there will be a knock-on effect by anything that happens.
Well, with me now is the chair of the Rail Delivery Group, Steve Montgomery. Very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us. Let's start on that news that the government's poised to announce legislation to curb the right to strike and enforce minimum service levels. It's thought to be in 6 areas, including rail. Is that something that you'd welcome?
I think it's something for government to decide what they want to do with it. Obviously, clearly the level of disruption that we're seeing on the rail industry in particular has been quite significant and has obviously impacted on a lot of people's daily lives. So again, we haven't seen the legislation yet. We don't understand the full elements of it. Until we get that, then we'll look at it and see how we can apply it once it's get passed, obviously through whatever method government wants to put it through. And so there's a bit of work to be done to be fully understand it at this moment in time.
Well, yes, you're right. We do need to wait for more detail. But Mick Whelan suggested that this minimum service legislation could be unworkable and could even drive a further wedge between the unions and the rail companies. What do you think? Do you think this could make things worse?
I think we have to wait and see what the legislation says. Really at this moment in time, it's difficult to really give a straight answer here. I think obviously any further legislation is always something that people will challenge. But again, we've got an industry, particularly the rail industry, which I'm here to talk about, that is going through significant pain at this moment in time, and its customers are suffering really badly. And none of us want to see that. What we want to do is try and get these disputes resolved and make sure that we've got a service that we can be proud of to give to customers. And at the moment, it's not a great place to be in for the staff, for management, for stakeholders, and the trade unions don't like to be in this position either. So we've got to try and resolve the dispute that we're in at the moment.
Your dispute is, of course, with ASLEF and RMT, the rail companies continuing discussions with both of those unions. I spoke to Mick Whelan from ASLEF just a short time ago. He said once again that his workers haven't seen a pay rise since 2019. So are you going to give them one?
We want to give people a pay increase. Again, the industry, we have to understand that the industry is probably 20% of revenue below where it was in 2019. Staff have not had a pay increase from them. We've been talking to the trade unions, and we do genuinely want to give people a pay increase, but we need to reform. The industry can't keep taking lots of taxpayers' money. We're roughly about £175 million per month in lost revenue. So what we're saying to the trade unions is, work with us, bring in sensible areas of reform that we can then use some of that money to go and give people a pay increase. We can't just keep taking taxpayers' money. There's obviously other competing sectors, whether it's the education, NHS, military, all those different sectors are all looking for additional money. And the rail industry has to go and cut its own cloth. And I think with sensible reform, we can look at how we can self-fund a pay deal, but we need the trade unions to work with us in that area.
Well, yes, and you're in dispute with the RMT as well. Network Rail, in a separate dispute, say they think they're within touching distance of a deal with them. They think they can talk union members round to an offer. Do train companies think that they can talk the RMT round, or is it months of more strikes?
I'd hope not. I think we are closer. We've got more work to do with the RMT. But I do think we are closer than we've been in a long time. We just need to get back around the table and keep talking sensibly. And I think we are in a better place than we've probably been in the last number of months. But we've got a bit of work still to do with RMT.
And Mick Lynch made a specific claim to us this week that you were close to a deal, but it was scuppered by the Department of Transport, who put in clauses insisting on a driver-only operation, which infuriated their members. What do you say to that? Is that true?
I think, we've always had driver-only operation was in the original mandate that we had with RMT and with government. We're working through that. We can see how there's different ways we can do things. So it's really important that people understand that, we've got an industry where driver-only operation is already in use in a large number of services. So it's not something new that we're trying to bring onto the table. And where a lot of this reform, whether it's ASLEF, whether it's RMT, is actually carried out in some companies, but not in other companies. So we're just trying to get standardisation. It's not about asking people to work longer. Most drivers are a 35-hour week, an average of a 35-hour week. We're not asking people to work longer or take pay cuts. What we're trying to do is get people to work within that 35 hours and be more productive. And that's not going to cost anybody anything. That can help us fund a pay increase for staff and make the railway more sustainable for the long term. And that's what we're looking to try and do. And it's not massive reform that's going to, have people working the full 35 hours. We're a train driver, and particularly we've got to take into account safety. So it's really sensible reform that we're looking for that can then allow us to then fund a pay increase.
Well, Steve Montgomery, Chairman of the Rail Delivery Group, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now we're going to return now to our coverage of Pope Benedict's funeral, which gets underway shortly, with the main service being led by his successor, Pope Francis. Let's show you the scene while I bring in Sky Events commentator Alistair Bruce, who's here with me now. Welcome, Alistair. What can we expect today?
Well, it's a very normal Roman Catholic Mass for the dead, and it's a reflective service. It is an opportunity for all Catholics to reflect upon someone who led their church for quite a period and who has been present since in this extraordinarily unique way of having abdicated the highest role in the Church of Rome. And I think that what we will see is a very reflective, very peaceful and immensely beautiful service in the most extraordinary setting of St. Peter's Square in the heart of the Vatican City at Rome.
And how different will it be from the kind of funeral you would normally expect for a pope? Will it be very similar, even though this is a pope who'd resigned?
Well, it'll be different in that normally when a pope who is reigning dies, there then is a period called the empty seat, the sede vacante, where the cardinals who gather wait to decide who amongst them will become the next pope. Because we had the abdication from the role by Pope Benedict XVI, he has been living in the Vatican since Pope Francis was appointed. And they have worked, as it were, not together, but Pope Benedict has been able to carry on his researches and his prayer, while Pope Francis has led the Church in Benedict XVI's place. And so it's unique that we'll have a Pope celebrating the Mass at the funeral obsequies of his predecessor.
So a really unusual moment, that in itself.
Yes. And Benedict XVI had led the funeral Mass for John Paul II. And I think it's interesting that Benedict XVI has asked to be interred under St. Peter's, exactly where his predecessor, John Paul II, was placed before he was brought up to the main St. Peter's Basilica, because he was beatified, which Roman Catholics do if they wish to choose someone who has behaved so perfectly, both in life and afterwards, in the ability to create miracles. And so I think that, continues this story. And for people who aren't Christian or who aren't Roman Catholic, I think it'll be an opportunity to understand the faith and see carried out this moment that has meant so much to Christians in Europe throughout the centuries, back to St. Peter, who was, as it were, the first pope who was one of the disciples of Jesus Christ. And as our dates come from that time, we know pretty much exactly how long ago that was, which is 2023 years.
So a big moment for the Roman Catholic Church and for those who follow its faith around the world. What about personally for Pope Francis? I mean, what was his relationship like with Pope Benedict, given that they existed close together for many recent years?
Well, it can be very difficult, can't it, when you take over a role and the person who had it before you is still around. But Benedict XVI recognised, perhaps for health reasons that we will get more information about later on, that he really was not able to carry on being the head of the church. So he stepped back, and he said when he stepped away from the office that he would entirely do so. And he has fulfilled that completely, I think, in support of his successor. But I'm sure that it's also quite nice, if you're in this lonely place of leadership, to be able to go and have a chat with someone in the way that, certainly in the past reign, prime ministers were able to go and talk to the Queen, who was a continuing presence. I think to an extent maybe Pope Francis has found that very reassuring. But as we look into St. Peter's now and all the congregation are gathering, there is an enormous number of concelebratory, which means people who are going to be helping with the celebration of the Mass. Cardinals, over 100 of them, bishops and priests who will help Pope Francis in the leading of this funeral Mass.
And they had quite a different style as popes, didn't they? What will the tone of this service be? Will it very much reflect Pope Benedict's style?
Well, I think the point where we will get that reflection will be in the homily, which is like an address that's given by the Pope to better help people understand the moment of the breaking of bread and wine, which is what Jesus Christ set as an example to all Roman Catholics and Christians. So when he explains and prepares people for that, he will have a chance to reflect upon the man who was Pope Benedict XVI, who was Joseph Ratzinger, the Archbishop and Cardinal from Germany, who had been born in a time of challenge for Germany. So I think it will be very interesting to hear what Francis says, and I think he's always been very, very affectionate about his predecessor. I mean, you know, exactly how he will prepare the congregation for this moment. And after all, for Christians, death is a celebration in its own way of moving to eternal life. So if you are Christian and believe that, then it is a very moving service that we're going to witness today.
Well, yes, and describe the scene to us, Alistair, because we are expecting tens of thousands of people to arrive in Rome. Who are amongst the attendees and what's likely to happen?
Well, the procession is now bringing Pope Benedict XVI, the emeritus Pope who resigned from office, from St. Peter's Basilica out to rest on the steps. And for all those present, it is a signal of the beginning of the act of worship. And when he is placed on the steps, everyone will take their places for a period of reflection. And in due course, Pope Francis will take his seat. And the purpose of this process is to have that period of reflection. But coming out from St. Peter's into this extraordinarily impressive square created by Bellini's enfolding arms of the pillared sides, and also at the center of the square will be the great pillar that we believe witnessed the crucifixion of St. Peter, who was Christ's first head of the church back at the beginning of the Christian church itself.
Ci disponiamo alla celebrazione della Santa Messa, pregando insieme il Santo Rosario.
We prepare to celebrate Mass by praying the Holy Rosary together.
Nos disponemos para la celebración de la Santa Misa, rezando juntos el Santo Rosario.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Primo mistero doloroso. L'agonia di Gesù nel Getsemani.
First joyful mystery, the agony in the garden.
Primer misterio doloroso, la oración en el huerto.
Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Ave Maria, grazia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tui mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
The large congregation, expected to be about 30,000 today in St. Peter's Square, and being invited to pray using their rosaries, which is a preparatory tradition, a chance for all Roman Catholics to reflect upon their faith and the Mass that is to come. You have many of the cardinals and archbishops and bishops of the Roman Catholic Church have gathered, many priests too, wearing their white albs and their stoles, the red stoles over their shoulders. And the service will begin in due course. But the late Pope Emeritus has been placed in his cypress coffin at the heart of this gathered congregation. Close aides such as Archbishop George Ganswine, who was his long-term private secretary, present, been with him since Pope Benedict as cardinal, was the prefect, that is the head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, which was part of the Curia, which is the government of the Roman Catholic Church in Rome.
Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tui mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tui mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tui mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tui mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. Sic erat in principio et nunc et semper.
We can see the chair where Pope Francis will celebrate the funeral mass for his predecessor, who, in that very simple coffin, rests ready for that funeral service to begin.
The scourging at the pillar.
Segundo misterio doloroso, la flagelación de Jesús atado a la columna.
Pater noster, qui es in cielo,
Placed upon the coffin, we saw
adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua,
the scripture laid out in an open book, and also the rosary that was used by Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. The mists of Rome have closed in over the dome of the basilica here,
Ave Maria, gratia
and the camera
plena,
passes
Dominus
by the
tecum,
base of that
benedicta
great
tui
pillar,
mulieribus, et benedictus
which is known as the
fructus
silent
ventris
witness,
tui, Iesus.
which had been at the centre of the Colosseum in Rome in ancient times when St. Peter was brought
Ave Maria, gratia
to
plena,
that Colosseum
Dominus tecum,
and
benedicta
crucified.
tui mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tui mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui.
The funeral mass
Iesus.
for Pope Benedict XVI will begin at 8:30 local time, but
Ave
until
Maria,
that time,
gratia plena, Dominus tecum,
we will
benedicta tui mulieribus,
join with those
et
who are here in St.
benedictus
Peter's
fructus
Square
ventris tui,
in reflection
Iesus.
and preparation for the funeral of Pope Benedict XVI.
Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tui mulieribus, et benedictus
Alice Bruce, thanks very much
fructus
indeed, and we'll
ventris
return
tui,
very
Iesus.
shortly to St. Peter's Square in Rome.
Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tui mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.